pieces of 8, doubloons, ducats, francs, and even rubles ever since coins were invented. The main metal used for minting them has been gold. Until the 1970s, most world currencies were tied to the US dollar. And the dollar itself was tied to gold. This gold standard eventually came to an end. But gold is still considered one of the most stable assets on the planet. Today, countries like the United States need a lot of gold, a whole lot of gold, to conduct effective financial policy. And it all has to be stored somewhere. There is one place on Earth that can truly be called the world's main gold vault. Today, I'll tell you about Fort Knox, the key vault of America's financial system. Strictly speaking, Fort Knox is a US military base in Kentucky, but we'll be talking about the gold depository itself. At the moment, it holds 4.5 tons of gold bars. At current prices, the market value of Fort Knox's reserves is roughly $320 billion. That's about 10 times Estonia's GDP, or the equivalent of 100 Moscow city budgets. How is Fort Knox built? What's stored there besides gold? And what does James Bond have to do with it? You're watching History's Omitted, where stories don't just get told, they finally get explained. The 1,930 seconds, the peak of the Great Depression. U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt realizes that if the government doesn't immediately print huge amounts of dollars, the country will have no chance of escaping the crisis. But with the currency tied to the gold standard, printing money freely was impossible. So the president takes a desperate step. He signs an executive order nationalizing gold. Every person and company was required to hand over all their gold to a special government facility and receive compensation at a fixed price. One official later recalled that Roosevelt came up with the price every morning over breakfast and once raised it by 21 cents, just because he believed 21 was a lucky number. As a result, the government collected around 500 tons of gold in bars, coins, and jewelry. In the early 20th century, America's gold reserves were stored in 2 coastal cities, New York and Philadelphia. But existing vaults were too small to hold the enormous amount of newly nationalized gold. On top of that, the military feared both coastal cities were too vulnerable to naval attacks or air raids. So the government decided to build a new, secret vault, deep inland, protected by the Appalachian Mountains. Construction finished in 1936, and even in modern terms, the project wasn't expensive, only about $9 million. The site covers 17 hectares. The name Fort Knox came from the neighboring military base, named after the first US Secretary of War, Henry Knox. As soon as construction workers left, the vault began receiving shipments of gold. The high-security operation lasted 6 months. Gold was picked up from New York and Philadelphia by postal trucks, then transported to Kentucky by armored rail cars, and finally delivered to the vault by soldiers from the base. The Americans feared robbery so much that each stage of the operation resembled an elaborate theater production. Postal trucks moved only at night, trains departed at random times, and several decoy trains ran on other routes to confuse potential criminals. In the end, the new vault contained half of the entire U.S. gold reserve at the time. When World War II broke out in Europe, the U.S. began strengthening its defenses. As I said, coastal cities were at risk, so Fort Knox started receiving not only gold, but everything valuable that needed protection. By 1941, the original copy of the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and handwritten versions of major presidential speeches were moved from Washington to Fort Knox. The vault continued to fill after America entered the war. The U.S. evacuated gold from European countries, nearly tripling the reserve. The United Kingdom sent its royal regalia for safekeeping the crown of Scotland, the sword of Edward the Confessor, and the scepter of Edward VII. When Nazi troops retreated into Austria, they stole Hungary's holy crown of St. Stephen. American soldiers intercepted it and sent it to Fort Knox for 40 years. In total, relics from almost 20 European countries passed through the vault. The Cold War added one of the strangest chapters to Fort Knox's history. In the 950 seconds, the US Department of Defense began storing opium and morphine in the vault. The government feared that in a major war, poppy supplies would be cut off, leaving the country without raw materials for painkillers. Over 2 decades, the vault accumulated 31 tons of narcotic raw material, enough to supply every state with painkillers for a full year. The problem arose in the 1,990 seconds. The Cold War was over, poppy production was no longer threatened, but the government had no legal way to sell the opium. A few years ago, the US Department of the Treasury announced that all narcotics had been removed, but who disposed of them and how remains a mystery. Now, imagine you've lost your mind and decided to rob Fort Knox. You certainly won't be able to take all the gold unless your heist somehow lasts several months. But even one truck filled to the roof with gold bars would net you about $2 billion, which isn't too bad. Let's say you found a used truck, bought a few dollies for moving the bars, assembled a team of equally reckless lunatics, and headed off. On the way, you should brief your crew that the first step is getting through an active military base, home to an entire tank division, and roughly 10,000 soldiers. But let's assume you manage that too. Next, you'll need to get your truck past a 10-meter, 33-foot electrified fence. Turning it off would trigger alarms on 3 different military bases in Kentucky. But suppose you've bribed the communication officers, and they're all sleeping soundly with earplugs in. Behind the fence lies a peaceful-looking lawn, which also happens to be a minefield. Using metal detectors, you all carefully weave your way toward the building. Inside, 200 elite guards will be waiting. To reach them, you'll first have to get through a special blast door, and to blow it open, you'd need at least a tactical nuclear device. But let's say you're inside anyway. You and your team descend 4 meters underground and find yourselves facing the final barrier, a half-meter thick steel door weighing 20 tons. According to international standards, security doors are classified into 13 categories. Regular office and apartment doors fall between classes 1 and 4. Russian bank vaults typically use classes 5, 6, or 7. Fort Knox's entrance is protected by a class 1-3 door, the highest possible. It can't be drilled, burned through, or blown apart. The only way in is with the correct numerical combination, but no single person knows the whole code. Parts of it are distributed among 4 different employees, whose work schedules are randomized weekly. But let's assume you've identified all 4 of them and had a convincing conversation. With trembling hands, the last of them enters their part of the code, and the massive door slowly slides open. Inside, you see a sight described by the New York Times. Floor-to-ceiling stacks of 36,000 gold bars, 3 meters high, glowing dimly in the half-light. To fill your truck, you need about 80 trips. One important detail, you'll need special footwear. A gold bar is extremely heavy. Drop one on your foot and you'll shatter several bones. That's why vault specialists wear boots reinforced with magnesium for extra protection. Carefully avoiding the landmines on your way out, you load up the truck and drive off into the sunset, or better yet, the sunrise, since it's easier to work at night. Now, all that's left is to find a buyer who won't ask for proper spectrographic analysis or precise weighing. You'd probably have to melt the gold and sell it in small batches to avoid suspicion. With about a year of careful, dangerous work, you could become a dollar millionaire, assuming you didn't fail at any stage, forgot about security cameras with night vision, left traces of your DNA, or misjudged Fort Knox's defenses. Because everything we know about Fort Knox's security comes from open sources, most of them dating back to the early 2000s. It's quite possible the vault now includes lasers, motion sensors, and temperature detectors. In short, be prepared for anything. The phrase, "as secure as Fort Knox," has become a metaphor for maximum protection. Even Samsung named its security system after it. But history knows one successful infiltration of America's main vault, though only on film. I'm talking about the 3rd James Bond movie, Goldfinger. The brilliant Sean Connery as Agent 007, a squadron of strikingly beautiful pilots led by Pussy Galore, and the villain Auric Goldfinger, a man literally obsessed with gold. Auric comes from aurum, the Latin word for gold, and Goldfinger means golden finger. Goldfinger's plan was astonishing. He didn't want to steal Fort Knox's gold. Instead, he wanted to detonate a dirty bomb inside the vault, making the entire US gold reserve radioactive for decades. His logic? Gold prices would skyrocket, making him a billionaire and turning China into a global superpower. His scheme was nothing like the one I described earlier. He planned to drop gas bombs over the base, killing soldiers and guards, then use a powerful laser to cut through the vault and detonate the dirty bomb. America's financial system was saved by Pussy Galore, whom Bond, of course, fell in love with. She warned the military and dispersed harmless gas instead. The impact of Goldfinger on popular culture wasn't just launching Sean Connery's career or featuring the first openly lesbian characters in mainstream cinema. Strangely enough, most Americans still imagine Fort Knox as it was shown in the movie. Naturally, the film crew wasn't allowed to shoot inside the real vault, but thanks to the producer's connections and charm, the scene in which the squadron flies over the vault was filmed at the real Fort Knox. Witnesses later recalled that even with permission, flying over the vault felt terrifying. Machine guns on the towers tracked the planes, and when the crew tried to drive closer for a better shot, they were warned off with loudspeakers. The film set had little resemblance to the real interior of Fort Knox as seen in 1,970 seconds photographs. The vault in Goldfinger looks more like a prison, but the shooting was so convincing that the studio had to post armed guards on set, fearing that even fake gold bars might tempt thieves. In addition to its 4.5 tons of gold bars, the vault stores several valuable artifacts. Britain's and Hungary's royal regalia were eventually returned, but the US has its own treasures. For example, Fort Knox holds the double eagle coin, the world's third most valuable coin. Its face value is just $20, but collectors are willing to pay over $11 million for it. One of the few non-gold items is a Sacagawea dollar, an ordinary copper coin worth $1. But 12 of these coins flew aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia in 1999 and spent 5 days in orbit. They were never released for public sale. It's impossible to imagine what they'd be worth. Beyond the gold and rare coins, Fort Knox has become fertile ground for conspiracy theories. The reason is clear. The government has classified all information about the vault, its security system, and the exact amount of valuables stored there. Over time, countless myths and rumors have emerged. The most common one claims that the vault is actually empty. This theory first surged in the 1,970 seconds. Lawyer Peter Beater, once a high-ranking official in the US financial system, later fired under corruption allegations, became one of America's most famous conspiracy theorists. His ideas were colorful. He claimed that the world government consisted of the Rockefellers, Zionists, and the Kremlin, that US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was actually a robot, and that large portions of Fort Knox's gold had been sold off by European speculators. His sensational claims stirred such a media storm that in 1974, a delegation, including the director of the U.S. Mint and 100 influential journalists, was allowed into Fort Knox, only the second such visit in history. The first visitor had been Roosevelt himself, checking on construction. Journalists found no signs of wrongdoing, and conspiracy theories quieted for a while. A new wave followed the 2008 financial crisis. Conspiracy forums circulated photos of an empty vault. Fox News aired reports fueling speculation. Republican Senator Ron Paul openly said he didn't trust Federal Reserve reports on the gold supply. Conspiracy theorists claimed most of the gold had been sold to prop up the economy and the rest stolen by corrupt officials. More moderate skeptics suggested the gold was still there, but that it was fake. In 2017, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and several officials visited Fort Knox, the third authorized visit in history. Mnuchin wrote on Twitter that the gold was safe, but conspiracy theorists were, unsurprisingly, unmoved. Other theories are even more bizarre. Peter Beater claimed that Fort Knox stored frozen bodies of assassinated world leaders, awaiting future regeneration technology. Some believe the vault contains alien remains recovered after the famous Roswell incident. My favorite conspiracy involves a strange detail about the vault's design. At one point, the director of the US Mint casually mentioned that Fort Knox has a special escape tunnel for anyone accidentally trapped behind the massive door. The tunnel opens only from the inside, and only when the main doors are locked. The press immediately speculated that the tunnel was added after a tragic incident in which an employee was accidentally sealed inside and starved to death. Such a rich field of conspiracies exists not only because gold is inherently captivating, but because the government has always surrounded Fort Knox with secrecy, feeding the imagination of millions. If you found this fascinating, subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends and colleagues. You've been watching History's Omitted. A new video is coming soon. See you next time.